welcome you to this week of Coming to Terms. My name is Rick Henderson. I'm the lead pastor here at Autumn Ridge Church. I'm so glad you're tuning in with us. The last time that I flew, can you remember the last time you got to fly somewhere? The last time I flew into a different city, I had to rent a car so that I could get around. And I did what probably many of you do. When I was looking for the rental car, I looked for the best deal that I could find. Now, I'm happy to take the best deal, even if that means when I land at the airport, I got to take a shuttle to another part of town to get the rental car. I would happily give up convenience in order to have a little bit more money in my pocket. Maybe some of you can relate to that. Last time I flew, that's exactly what happened. Huge mistake. I landed, found the shuttle, jumped in, went to the rental car place, and as we pulled in, what I saw didn't really look like a rental car lot. It looked like an impound lot. But what I thought to myself was, hey, it's really no big deal. You get what you pay for. I'd rather have a few more bucks in my pocket than maybe have a really shiny car. So confidence still intact, I walked inside the lobby of the rental car company. And what I saw was a lobby that was disheveled. It was dirty. It felt like a mashup of the DMV and an episode of The Walking Dead. Things looked horrible. Employees were shuffling about, not actually helping anybody. There were 4 people behind the counter. 2 of them had their backs to us, just yucking it up, not doing any work, not assisting anybody. Did I mention the line was incredibly long? So there I am, standing in line. My confidence level is hitting the floor. I pulled out my phone and I did what I should have done before making the reservation. I began to read the reviews of this company. And many of the reviews that I read started with this line right here. I only gave 1 star because it's impossible to leave 0 stars. I knew that I was in for trouble. It was going to be a bad experience. After about an hour of standing in line, I finally make it to the counter and it's my turn. Here's a picture of the car they gave me. They did not have a car for me. They gave my car away to somebody in front of me and they had no car to give me. And yet they were kind enough to give me a ride back to the airport so I could do business with another company. And as I jumped on this shuttle, I was surrounded by other people who had the exact same experience I did. Let me tell you, that was an angry ride and the language was not suitable for children. Now, here's what some of you might be thinking. Hey, Rick, next time you make a reservation, I bet you're going to read the reviews first. You're exactly right. I will. It would have saved me time, would have saved me a huge headache. Well, let me ask you. Aren't there times in life that you wish you could have read the reviews before you got into it? Aren't there times in life you wish that it was possible to read the reviews before you made a commitment to something because you would have done something totally different? And I want to take that question and I want to shift the spotlight onto something that might make some of us feel uncomfortable. It might even make you feel unsettled. And here's my question. Do you ever feel like you should have read the reviews before taking the Bible seriously? I want to share with you some very real 1-star reviews of the Bible that I found online. Here they are. Totally irrelevant in modern day and thoroughly outdated. It's mainly boring, only occasionally funny and interesting. That's why it's so hard to read. Poorly written, repetitive, conflicting stories, and then this is edited for profanity, that should be tossed and never heard of again. And there are many other 1-star reviews that you could read online. But it's this one that I really want us to focus on. Is the Bible conflicting? Is the Bible contradictory? Does it contradict itself? Now, if you would say, Rick, I think the Bible does contradict itself, you might be surprised by who it is that agrees with you. Right now, we are in a series called Coming to Terms, and it's based on a book of the Bible that you'll find almost at the very end of the Bible. And the book that we're reading through is called James. And it's called James because it was written by a guy named James, and he's very likely the brother, maybe even the little brother of Jesus. And one of the most famous Christians in history left a 1-star review of the book of James. The guy I'm talking about is Martin Luther. He said this, St. John's Gospel And his first epistle, St. Paul's epistles, especially those Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, and St. Peter's first epistle, these are the books which show thee Christ and teach thee everything that is needful and blessed. St. James' epistle is a right strawy epistle. That means trash. It's right strawy epistle, or it's trash in comparison with them, for it has no gospel character to it. That is Martin Luther's way of saying it's contradictory, even though he doesn't use the word contradictory or conflicting. That's his way of saying, you know what? The Bible would probably be better off if James wasn't included. That's his way of saying, you know what? If you take James seriously, you might end up with the same kind of experience that I had with a rental car company. Now, that's a serious burn. Is he right? Well, today, you're going to get to decide that for yourself. What I'm about to read and what we're going to wrestle in together over the next few minutes is probably one of the more controversial passages in the New Testament. It's one of those passages that people look at and they say, I think this is a point where the Bible contradicts itself. It is likely the reason that Martin Luther said James is a straw epistle. James is kind of a piece of trash. Today, you get to decide, is he right or is he wrong? Let's look at James. James chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it? What's the value? What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? And he asks this question, can such a faith save them? Now, James is leaning into one of the major questions of life. Do you remember the 4 major questions of life? We include them almost every week. Here they are. The 4 major questions are origin, meaning, morality, destiny. And destiny is, where am I ultimately headed? Is there anything for me on the other side of death? Now, James is no stranger to making bold statements. And what James is saying is, your destiny is on the line. My destiny is at stake. Where you or I end up on the other side of death, he's saying it has everything to do with, it hinges on whether or not we get this right or we get this wrong. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe James, regardless of where you stand on his hot take, even if you aren't convinced by his perspective yet, I want to share something with you. When someone is brave enough and honest enough to make a bold statement, that's a lean-in moment. When someone is brave enough to lay their cards on the table and say, this is how I see it, that's a lean-in moment. You don't have to take someone's position to take them seriously. You don't have to take James's position to take him seriously. Do you know what wise people do? Do you know what kind people do? Even when someone makes a bold statement, even when someone has a hot take, their response is this: tell me more. Tell me more about why you see it the way you see it. Tell me more about what convinced you. So let's do that. Let's let James tell us a little more. This is what he says. Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs. What good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. Faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. If you're familiar with anything that Jesus taught, Jesus often taught that allegiance to him, and remember, that's what faith means. Faith is allegiance, or faith is placing your trust into something. Jesus taught that allegiance to him, or trust in him, or following him will always be expressed as love for other people. It's so important to Jesus that he actually elevated love for others to be equivalent to or equal to, not the same as, but equal status with love for him. It's so important that Jesus said, we cannot separate the two. Do you know what love does? Love moves toward the messes. And so any expression of allegiance, any expression of faith that doesn't move towards the everyday messes of life, it's dead. Any expression of allegiance that doesn't move us to serve needs, even if those needs are not our fault and not our responsibility, that's dead. Any expression of allegiance that doesn't move us to give away our resources to solve things that aren't even our responsibility, aren't even our fault, that's dead. Any expression of allegiance that doesn't move us to hurt with hurting people, even if their hurts are not our responsibility and their hurts are not our fault, it's dead. James presses this further. You foolish person. Apparently nobody told him about Minnesota Nice. You foolish person. Do you want evidence? Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? So here he's going to make his case. Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? If you aren't familiar with that story from the Old Testament, go read Genesis 22. It's an amazing story of love and trust and action of Abraham trusting God. You got to read it. I don't have time to get into it. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. If you know anything about Martin Luther, and maybe you don't, so let me tell you, Martin Luther is famous for teaching something many other people from the Reformation, many other people since then have taught this, sola fide. It's Latin and means faith alone. And yet here it is, plain as day. James says, not by faith alone. So it seems like James is saying, you're not saved by faith alone. You're not accepted into God's family by faith alone. It's faith and works is what's needed to save you. Right? Now, if you're having trouble seeing how this statement from James might contradict other things in the New Testament, let me share with you something the Apostle Paul wrote. It's this. It comes from Romans chapter 3. The Apostle Paul wrote, "For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." Justified by faith apart from what you do. It seems like these two writers of the New Testament are at war with each other. So let me ask you this question. We're going to shift gears a little bit. Have you ever had a big fight with somebody? I'm talking like an all-day fight with someone. Years ago, very, very early on in our marriage, my wife Heather and I, we had one of those all-day fights. And it wasn't just that we disagreed with each other. She could not understand how in the world I could see it the way that I saw it. I couldn't understand how in the world can she see it the way that she sees it. The fight had gotten personal. And there were hours of tears, and we were just at our wits' end with each other. And after hours of hot debate and stinging tears, it happened. We realized hours into this fight, we had agreed with each other the whole time. We agreed with each other the whole time we were fighting. We were saying the exact same thing, but in different ways. And because we were newly married, we hadn't learned how to speak each other's language yet. It was simultaneously relieving and embarrassing. Did you know James and Paul were friends? Did you know that James and Paul publicly stated in front of other people that they taught the exact same thing as each other? Not something similar, not something close. What they taught, their message was identical. And we know that because the Apostle Paul wrote about it in Galatians chapter 2. He says this, "As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism." We've talked about that. And then he says, "They added nothing to my message." Who are the they? It's James, it's Peter, it's John, it's the other people who were with Jesus personally. He continues. James, the very James who wrote the book of James, Cephas, that's a nickname for Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars, those giants, those heroes of the faith, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. They embraced them, they affirmed them when they recognized the grace given to me. Paul and James were friends, not just friends, they were good friends. They considered each other brothers. They publicly celebrated what the other taught. They embraced each other. And so if there's any confusion, it's not on their part, it's on our part. Kind of like that all-day fight I had with my wife. And here's the deal. If you're confused or if you're lacking clarity, if I'm confused, if I'm lacking clarity, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. All it means is we got a little bit more work to do. Just like any good researcher, any good scientist, any good student, there's more investigation, there's more study for us to do. Now, it might be helpful for you to know that James talked about being considered righteous. Paul talked about being justified. Those two guys were using the exact same word. They wrote in Greek, and that Greek word is dikaio, and it means justify, and that word has two meanings. There's two meanings of the Greek word justify. The first definition is to pay off a debt or to make right. That's exactly what the Apostle Paul was talking about. James used the second definition to demonstrate that you are right. Paul uses this definition. James uses this definition. Totally appropriate, totally normal in the Greek language to use that one word with two different definitions. By the way, you and I do that all the time with our words in English. As a matter of fact, in English, we use the exact the two definitions for the same word, justified. How many of you, let me ask you this, how many of you have ever said something like, the end doesn't justify the means? If you say that, you're using the first definition. Just because it worked out well in the end, that doesn't make you right. Or how about this? How many of you have ever said something along the lines of, how do you justify your opinion? If you do that, you're using definition number 2. And you're basically saying, how can you demonstrate that your opinion is right? Here's another example, pretty mundane, but I think you'll get the picture. You go out to a lovely restaurant with your significant other, and you need to settle at the end of your meal. How do you make things right with a restaurant? You pay, or somebody has to pay. But how would you justify or demonstrate that things have been made right with the restaurant? Well, you show a receipt. That's exactly what's going on here. James and Paul are using the same word, but they're using it in different ways. Now, you might be saying, Rick, you've validated or you've proved your case that one word can justifiably, if I can use that pun, justifiably be used two different ways, but I haven't yet proven that that's exactly what's going on. So let's turn back and look at something the Apostle Paul wrote. In Ephesians 2, he says this, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it's a gift, not by works, so that no one can boast. So Paul's talking about you're justified by faith. Then he says this, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. You're saved by faith, and then after that comes good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. But Paul is trying to emphasize being made right with God by faith. And so Paul is doing this. Paul protected faith from being redefined by the earners. There's nothing you can do to earn grace. There's nothing you can do to earn forgiveness. There's nothing you can do to earn acceptance by God. That's a gift, and you receive that by giving your allegiance to Jesus. James is having a very different conversation. This is James' conversation. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs. What good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by actions, is dead. This is what James is doing. James protected faith from being redefined by the indifferent. You've probably heard this. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. It's not even bothering to care. And what James and Paul are both saying to us is this: if we don't get this doctrine right, we are going to get love wrong. We're going to get it wrong. So here's the deal. If I only love whenever it's convenient, let me start it this way. If love never costs me something, or if I'm unwilling to love whenever it costs me something, if I'm kind of an indifferent person, that means I'm only going to love when it's convenient. And if I only love when it's convenient, any expression of love that I give is not really an expression of love for you or someone else. It's an expression of love of myself because my starting point is convenience and self-concern. And yet love is serving and wanting and even sacrificing for the good of another. Well, let me talk to those of you who have had an approach with God that's a little bit more religious. If our approach to love is that we do it in order to earn something from God in return, well, that's not love either. If we're loving others in order to earn something from God, we're only going to love when it's expedient. And this is what we're doing. We're using someone else's hurt. We're using someone else's need. We're using someone else's hardship as a leverage to get something for ourselves. And so that's not love, because our starting point is self-concern, self-interest. And our expression isn't love for them or love for you. It's really a love for ourselves. We're using them to get for us. That's not love. Now, some of you may not yet be convinced. Some of you might be thinking, I don't know, I'm still kind of siding with Martin Luther's 1-star review, and maybe you need a little bit more to sway you over to my side of the fence. So let me give you this to consider. We'll only find errors in James if we forget that we are heirs with Christ. Both James and both Paul talked about this right here. Let me show you what I mean. This is what James said. We're going to go back to earlier in this passage. Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to, what's this word? Inherit. And to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him. Let's look at something the Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians. He said this, so you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you an heir. This is huge. Both Paul and James talked about being an heir, and there's a massive difference between being an earner and an heir. You see, an earner gets what they get based on how hard he or she worked. An heir is only and always paid based on how hard someone else worked. You see, an earner works for what he or she gets. An heir hasn't earned anything. Someone else has earned it and chosen to give it away. And that's the gospel. And so Paul and James, they're not contradictory. They're complementary. And what they're sharing with us is an aligned view of the gospel. You can't earn acceptance. You can't earn forgiveness. You can't earn grace. Jesus did that based on his own works, what he did on the cross and through his resurrection. And we receive that by faith, by giving him our allegiance. And then we demonstrate our faith. This is what James is talking about. We demonstrate our faith by how we live, by how we love. And to make sure that we get it, he presses down a little bit harder and he uses what might be a provocative example. James writes this, you believe that there is one God. Good. You believe there is one God. Good for you. That's basically how he's writing. Even the demons believe that and shudder. He's saying, hey, even demons acknowledge that. Even demons believe the truth and they have an emotional response to the truth. And if you're someone who would say, hey, a serious-minded person can't take demons seriously, allow me to let you off the hook right now. You don't have to take demons seriously to seriously consider what James has to say. But let me invite you to look at it again. Everything in Christianity hinges on a guy predicting his own death, predicting his resurrection, and then pulling it off. So isn't it at least possible? Isn't it possible that there's more to reality than what you and I can see on our own? Let's look at what James has to say a little bit more. He continues, you foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous. That's definition number 2. Didn't he demonstrate his faith by what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Again, you got to go read Genesis 22. If you have a family, maybe read it with your kids. He continues, you see that faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It's definition number 1. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous, definition number 2. A person demonstrates their faith, demonstrates their good standing with God by what they do and not by faith alone. So what I want to do just over the next couple of minutes, I want to take a picture, I want to take a chart, and let's use it to illustrate, to better understand exactly what James is saying. James says there's 2 kinds of faith. There is a faith that knows truth. And this faith acknowledges that the truth is true. And this faith might even have an emotional response to truth. But there's a totally different kind of faith. And this kind of faith is love and trust and action. And James labels this faith right here as demon faith. And he said, this faith right here, I'm talking about demonstrated faith. I'm curious, does anyone recognize the 2 men in this picture? This guy right here is Robert P. George, and the man hugging on him is Cornel West. These 2 are best friends, and I think our world could use more friendships like this. Robert George, he's a professor at Princeton. He's a legal scholar. He's a self-described political conservative. He's religiously conservative. Cornel West is a professor at Harvard. He teaches the practical public philosophy. He teaches African studies. He teaches African American studies. Cornel West is a self-described liberal Democrat. These 2 guys are nothing like each other, but it doesn't stop them from liking each other. They're best friends. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about something that Robert George does with his students. And what I'm going to tell you is a provocative story. But James used a provocative illustration, so I think it's okay for me to use a provocative illustration as well. But as I get into it, it's possible that for some of you, you are going to feel your emotions begin to rumble. And that's okay. That's allowed. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel. But before I jump into it, I want to remind you of something we said earlier. When someone is brave enough and honest enough to make a bold statement, that's a lean in moment. That's a tell me more kind of moment. This is what Robert George does with his students that he teaches. He asks them this question. If you were white and living in the South before abolition, what would your stance on slavery have been? He says that 100% of the time, every one of his students says that they would have been a staunch, committed abolitionist. And of course, he finds that answer problematic because only a tiny fraction of people were abolitionists. And only a tiny fraction of us, if we lived back then, would be abolitionists. And he shares that with his students, and they hate it. They do not like him saying that to them at all. But he says, all right, I will give your answer credit if you can demonstrate these things. He says, I'll give credit to your answer that you would have been a committed abolitionist if they have stood up for unpopular victims of injustice whose humanity has been denied. If their life can demonstrate that they did so knowing that it would make them unpopular with their peers. If they have evidence from their life that they did so knowing that they would be loathed and ridiculed by powerful, influential individuals and institutions. They did so knowing that they would be abandoned by many of their friends. Hey, does your life have any evidence that you would do this right here? That they did so knowing that they would be called nasty names and denied valuable professional opportunities. In short, show where they have, at risk to themselves and their futures, stood up for a cause that is unpopular in elite sections of culture today. And what Robert George says to his students is the exact same thing that James was saying to people back then, and he's saying to us today. It's easy to say something. It's easy to affirm something. It's easy to acknowledge something. But it is a totally different thing. It's a totally different thing to have love and trust in action. That is a kind of faith that's alive. That is biblical faith. And that's a faith that'll make you alive. Faith works. Jesus put his love on the line for you and for me. He did for us what we could never do for ourselves. We can't earn his love. We can't earn his grace. We can't earn his acceptance or his forgiveness. All we can do is give him our trust. All we can do is give him our allegiance. And when we do, we are made able and we are freed to love all others the way that he has loved us. And we don't love in order to be loved. We don't give love in order that we can get something. We love because we are loved. And that's why faith works.